Good morning. I thought I would begin today's class with a brief reading from Scripture. This is from Romans chapter 10. This is Paul writing to the people of Rome. And in one of the most important passages in the entire Bible, Paul says in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, "Because if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For man believes with his heart and so is justified, and he confesses with his lips and so is saved." Today's lecture is about the Mexican War. You'll recall that in the last lecture, the topic was the revolt in Texas against Mexican authority. These two events are often confused. They're separated by about 10 years, and they have completely different results. And so perhaps the best way to remember the two events is to remember the results. The Texican Rebellion results in the independence of Texas. The Mexican War has very little to do with Texas. It has everything to do with seizing what is now the American Southwest in California from the Mexicans. So the results are very different. And yet also both very, very important. It's hard to imagine the modern United States without the American Southwest in California. So the Mexican War. James K. Polk was affectionately known as Young Hickory. Old Hickory was, of course, Andrew Jackson. And the reason that Polk was known as Young Hickory was because he looked a little bit like the old general, and he shared the Jackson's political principles. He's a Jacksonian. Finally, he is also from the state of Tennessee. But Polk lacked the personal charm, charisma, perhaps even leadership qualities that Jackson so constantly exhibited. As a Southerner and a Jacksonian, it should come as no surprise that Polk's political goals as president were, number one, tariff reduction. This is the great issue of the day, along with slavery. But to reduce the tariffs on imported goods was something that Southerners and the average person in America, by the way, wanted very much, because this would reduce the cost of those goods. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, Jackson pursued the acquisition of new territory, specifically California, the American Southwest, and of course, Oregon, which at this time, the Oregon country was owned by the British, although the two nations, Great Britain and the United States, had agreed to share occupancy of much of the Pacific Northwest at this time. Well, many historians rate James K. Polk very, very highly in the execution of his goals. He accomplishes his goals. And after all, isn't that how we measure presidents? Generally, it is. But those who are critical of Polk, and there is good reason to be critical, argue that the goals themselves were immoral. Obviously, Henry Clay and those who supported Clay's American system, and the Whigs in general, this is the other political party, the Whigs, were not fond of a Democratic president from Tennessee. They disagree with his policies. The Whigs are largely a party of New England and the upper Midwest. They disagree to some extent with expansion, and many of them are very much in favor of the protective tariff, a tariff that protected American industry from foreign competition. Well, Polk pressed Congress to pass the Walker Tariff of 1846, which saw substantial reductions in the tariff rates. So Southerners, many Westerners, many of the common people cheered President Polk. And then the president pressured Great Britain to give up control of much of the Pacific Northwest. And so eventually the border, the present day border between Canada and the state of Washington, for example, Idaho, was agreed on, the 49th parallel. This was done peacefully. So the acquisition of Oregon goes forth. But the acquisition of California, this time now from the Mexicans, would only come as a result of the Mexican War. So, the origins of the Mexican War. The annexation of Texas had occurred under the Tyler administration, that is, the presidential administration immediately preceding that of Polk. But the results did not hit the proverbial fan until Polk became president. 2 days after Polk's inauguration, the Mexican ambassador to the United States, under instructions from Mexico City, broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. You see, the Mexicans were upset over the fact they had lost Texas to begin with 10 years before, roughly. And now to see Texas slip away even further into the hands of the Americans, well, that was too much to bear. And so the Mexicans broke off diplomatic relations. Polk publicly tried easing the situation, but privately, he was intriguing in California. In October of 1845, he wrote the American consul, that is the diplomatic representative, in Monterey. Monterey, California is a major port city, major in those days, port city about in central California. And the consul's name was Thomas Larkin. And he told Larkin that the president would make no effort to publicly induce the Californians into the Union. That would provoke even greater trouble with Mexico. But he told Larkin, if the people of California should desire to unite their destiny with ours, they would be received as brethren. Now, many of the people of California were of Hispanic origin and not Americans at all. And of course, there's the Native American population. But there are some Americans there in California. Well, Larkin lined up the Americans, and he lined up the Californios, again, those who are of Hispanic descent. And he lined up these people largely to assist in the rebellion against Mexico. Meanwhile, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor, major figure now, to take American troops into Texas and place them on the Rio Grande. Now, the Rio Grande was not the border, the international border between Texas, that is the United States now, and Mexico. That border was the Nueces River, which was substantially north of the Rio Grande. So essentially, as far as the Mexicans are concerned, and frankly, many Americans, Polk is ordering Taylor to invade Mexico. And many historians, frankly, sympathize with the Mexicans and those Americans who are opposed to Polk in this regard. They see this as an aggressive invasion of a foreign nation. On the other hand, Texas had been independent for 10 years. And the Mexican government of that time, Santa Anna, had signed the treaty. That the present Mexican government did not appreciate the fact that Texas was independent. Of course, they're not independent at this point, but the Mexican government is still grieving over the loss of Texas. And now, since Texas is part of the United States, that just adds fuel to the fire. I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the Mexicans at this point. They lost Texas a decade before. They lost Texas in the way that territory was traditionally taken, lost, what have you, in amongst nations at that time, and well into the future, even to this day. So again, the Mexicans can be aggrieved as much as they like, but the fact is that Texas was long gone. But there was more to the story. In addition to the border situation in Texas, which was relatively a minor issue in the context of the Mexican War, the Americans also want California, and they want the American Southwest, or the Mexican Northwest, if you will. Forgive my slip into the more recent designations of geography. Well, I do have a great deal of sympathy for the Mexican position in regard to California and the Southwest. The Americans here are simply engaged in an enormous land grab, an aggressive military power that wants more territory. And this is the essential cause of the war with Mexico. So I'm blaming the United States and its aggressive policy of taking this territory from Mexico. So I'm siding with the Whigs in this analysis of the Mexican War. In the spring of 1846, Polk decided to use Mexico's unpaid debts. The Mexicans owed the United States some money. He decided to use that situation as a pretext for a war. This was not something that the Americans had just thought up. This was a common pretext for a war at this time. Oh, some nation had not paid its loans back, and so the offended nation would then invade the offendor and take over the territory or the government or what have you. Well, this is what Polk intends to do with Mexico. But before he could ask Congress for war on those terms, the president received word that Taylor's men on the border of on the Rio Grande now had been attacked, and 11 of Taylor's American soldiers had been killed by Mexican soldiers. Polk now argued that American soldiers had been attacked, and thus the country's honor and self-defense, its national security, were at stake. But the truth was that Polk had placed Taylor's men in harm's way. And Polk had hoped that something like this would have happened, or would happen, and that he would have an even more emotional cause for a war with Mexico, a cause that even more Americans would get behind. And of course, the Mexicans had foolishly obliged the Americans by attacking American forces on the Rio Grande. Well, there was substantial opposition to this war, especially in the North amongst the Whigs. John Quincy Adams, the former president, was the leader of Whig opinion in New England. And he was a staunch opponent of the war that he called a most unrighteous war. And Abraham Lincoln, an obscure, at this moment, one-term congressman from the backwoods of Illinois, repeatedly stood up in Congress and introduced what were called spot resolutions in the 1847 session. These spot resolutions called upon the president to name the spot on American soil where American blood had been shed. And these spot resolutions, Lincoln is arguing then that American blood, although clearly Taylor's men were American and their blood had been shed, they were not on American soil. They were on the Rio Grande, which was not the border at this time. And so Lincoln and Adams are sympathetic, and there are many others, by the way, are sympathetic to the Mexican cause. Now, I don't know about you, but when John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln are on a particular side of a controversial issue, this tends to impact my own thinking a great deal. Many New Englanders believe that the war was the work of, quote, land jobbers, those who want more land, and slave jobbers, the slave-holding aristocracy of the South. They want to be able to move out west and get new land and take their slaves with them. The Massachusetts poet James Russell Lowe wrote, "They just want this California so's to love new slave states in, to abuse you and to scorn you and to plunder you like sin." The early months of the war. Both the United States and Mexico were ill prepared for a major war. At the outset of the war, the American army numbered only about 7,000 men. Americans then, and for 100 years, Their peacetime army was always relatively small, that is relative to other nations of the world of their size and significance. The Mexicans could field a force of 32,000 men, 4 times, almost 5, the American force. Of course, before the war ended, the American army had grown to well over 100,000. Now, Zachary Taylor's men down there on the Rio Grande scored 2 early, although relatively minor, victories against Mexican forces on the north side, that is to say, the American side of the great river, the Rio Grande. And then on May 18th, Taylor crossed the river and occupied the Mexican city of Matamoros. So we have officially, according to everyone's calculation of the situation, invaded Mexico. These quick victories brought Taylor significant fame back in America. And anytime an American general achieves fame at this point, and again for another well over 100 years, that general becomes almost automatically a candidate for the presidency of the United States. And so the public now clamors that Taylor be put in charge of a deeper invasion of Mexico. And Polk agreed, because at this moment, it didn't seem likely that Taylor was a reasonable political candidate who might oppose him in the coming presidential election. So Taylor is to invade Mexico still further. While that is being organized, let's move out west to California. Indeed, the Californians had not waited for a war to be declared back in Washington, D.C. And then the United States aided the Californians when John Charles Fremont, the famous pathfinder, an explorer and a member of the American military, descended from Oregon and into Northern California and invaded Central California and took Sonoma. The Californians now proclaimed the California Republic and hoisted the Bear flag. So for a few weeks, months, the Californians have their own country, the California Republic, the so-called Bear Flag Republic. And then Commodore Robert Stockton and the American Navy took Monterey. There's a city on the Central California coast called Monterey, not to be confused with the Mexican city of Monterey in northern Mexico. So Stockton and the Navy took Monterey on the Pacific coast, and they claim now California for the United States. Most Californians of all races, that is the Hispanics and the whites and so forth, preferred becoming a state of the United States as opposed to an independent republic. So California is well on its way to becoming first an American territory and then a little bit later an American state. In July, Stockton joined his naval forces to Fremont's cavalry and invaded Southern California. Resistance was weak. Again, the Mexican presence, the government's presence in terms of civil authorities and military forces in California and throughout the entire Southwest, for that matter, is very weak. This war does not take a long time. And by the end of August, all of California belonged to the United States. Also in August, Stephen Kearny took New Mexico, and again, resistance was weak. And Kearny had marched overland to take New Mexico. And so in a few months, the Americans had taken California and all of what is now the modern American Southwest. Taylor's campaign in central Mexico, northern central Mexico. While California and New Mexico were being wrested from the Mexicans, Zachary Taylor waited for more men and ammunition and supplies in northern Mexico. Finally, in September of 1846, he began to move south. He soon took the Mexican city of Monterey that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. But President Polk was unhappy with the relatively easy terms of surrender that that Taylor had granted Mexican forces in this campaign. And Polk was also wary now of Taylor's growing popularity with the American electorate. Here was apparently a rival for the presidency. And so now Polk decides to send General Winfield Scott to Mexico and to emphasize Scott's campaign and to let Taylor kind of cool his heels in northern Mexico. And now Polk made a major blunder. He allowed the exiled Santa Anna to convince him that if the Americans allowed Santa Anna to return to Mexico, he would bring about favorable terms. But once he had returned to Mexico, Santa Anna, not surprisingly, stabbed Polk figuratively in the back, and then proceeded to defend Mexico with every ounce of his strength. Scott now lands at Veracruz, southern Mexico. It was the traditional landing place for those who were going to march inland and then up to Mexico City to take the Mexican capital. So that's Scott's plan, to make a landing at Veracruz and then march his army inland and take Mexico City. Meanwhile, Taylor's position in central Mexico was weakened when Polk ordered many elements of Taylor's army to proceed south and join Scott. Among those veterans ordered to leave Taylor and join Scott was a captain of engineers, a young military officer of great talent, Robert E. Lee. Those of you who are somewhat familiar with Civil War history will recognize the name Robert E. Lee. Lee, of course, was the man who would lead the major, most significant Southern Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, to victory after victory after victory in the Civil War, especially in the first 2.5 years of the war. Taylor, now bereft of many of his veterans, was ordered to just sit tight. However, Taylor chafed at such orders and decided to lead now his untested volunteers southwest towards Saltillo. He ran into Santa Anna's army. Santa Anna marched north out of Mexico City with a significant force, and the two forces then clashed at the Battle of Buena Vista. The arrogant Mexican general offered to accept Taylor's surrender, but the American responded, "Tell him to go to hell." The Battle of Buena Vista was a very, very close American victory. The Mexican forces retreated, and Taylor complained that if he had still had his veterans, then he would have whipped Santa Anna right there at Buena Vista. We'll never know. Scott's campaign. Meanwhile, the long-planned assault on the Mexican capital went forth in March of 1847. As Scott marched inland, the poor planning of the Americans became evident, as many of the enlistment terms of the American soldiers in Scott's army expired. Now they were legally free to turn around and go home, and thousands did. And so Scott now has to wait for reinforcements. Once reinforced and resupplied, Scott ascended into the great valley of Mexico where the Mexico City is located. Across the Atlantic Ocean, watching these events, the aging Duke of Wellington, one of Britain's great military heroes, the man who had defeated Napoleon in 1815, believed that the Americans had bit off more than they could chew, and that Scott's army would surely be defeated, as it was on foreign ground and vastly outnumbered by Mexican forces. I tell you this because I want you to appreciate what Scott and, frankly, Robert E. Lee were able to accomplish. Scott now executes a series of brilliant flanking maneuvers. A flanking maneuver is when one takes either one's army or a portion of one's army and moves over to the sides of your opponent instead of a frontal attack. You manage a flank attack, which oftentimes results in taking the enemy by surprise. And so amongst military strategists, a flanking attack is a favorite tactic. And the Mexicans believed that Scott would not be able to do this because the Valley of Mexico is a very, very difficult piece of terrain with lava fields and marshes and so forth. And of course, the Americans don't know this terrain very well. And so the Mexican generals, they discounted the ability of the Americans to launch flanking attacks. They were always prepared for a frontal attack. Well, Scott, again, managed to execute these flanking maneuvers. The Americans overwhelmed Mexican forces at the Battle of Chapultepec, and the Mexican city fell in September of 1847. At the National Palace, a battalion of Marines ran up the American flag and thus provided some of the lyrics for the Marine hymn. "From the halls of Montezuma" is a reference to the Mexican palace. The victories around Mexico City had been made possible by several factors. First, there was the poor morale of the Mexican soldiers in general. Second, there was political infighting amongst Mexican generals. Almost all of them wanted to be the great generalissimo, the leader, and so they didn't cooperate very much or very well with one another. And then too, frankly, there is the brilliant flanking strategy of the American forces, even though they're outnumbered by the Mexican army. Now, Scott's strategy was dependent upon excellent reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is just a fancy word for scouting. Discovering where the enemy is and how best to achieve those flanking maneuvers with significant forces. And much of this reconnaissance was performed by the aforementioned Robert E. Lee. Not only did Lee discover the routes which allowed the American forces to outflank the more numerous Mexican army, but having done so, he went back to the American forces and then led those forces to the proper places. Historian Emory Thomas, who's written a fine biography of Robert E. Lee and also a history of the Civil War, wrote of Lee's accomplishments. He had crossed the lava fields and led some of the army into conflict with Valencia's troops, Valencia, one of the Mexican officers, and then led 3 brigades into Valencia's rear. Then he had retraced his steps over the lava fields in the dark back to Scott's headquarters. That same night, he once again crossed the lava fields in order to place troops in Valencia's front. Next, he scouted the road from San Antonio to Churubusco, returned to Scott, and then guided troops to a crucial flank attack against the city of Churubusco. Scott wrote of Lee that he was gallant and indefatigable. That is, he could not be exhausted. And that his actions on the night of August 19th were, and I quote from Scott's dispatch, "the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by an individual, to my knowledge." And so the Americans have defeated the Mexicans and taken Mexico City, which brings us to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. When a war is completed, there's always a treaty. And in order to understand the results of the war, one must begin with the treaty. And as I hope you're all aware, when you're taking one of my classes, you must be particularly interested in the causes of the war and the results of the war. And then, of course, the significant or major participants in the war as well. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Peace negotiations began in January 1848. Polk appointed a young man by the name of Nicholas Trist as the chief negotiator. Negotiations were delayed because the same thing that had bedeviled the Mexican army, disagreement, lack of unity, and so forth, also delayed the arranging of a Mexican contingent to treat with Nicholas Trist. Polk now actually loses patience and he orders Trist recalled, come home. And now Polk intends to exact even more demanding terms from the dilatory Mexicans. But just before the recall message to Trist from Polk arrived, the Mexicans appointed a negotiating team. Trist now, with this recall message in hand, has a dilemma. What do I do? Do I go home and leave this thing up in the air, or do I ignore the recall message and go ahead and negotiate? He decides to do the latter. And so negotiations proceed based on Polk's original terms. And so eventually the Mexicans agreed to these conditions. Number one, Mexico gave up all claims to Texas above what? Which river? The Rio Grande, of course. And so this is now the modern border between Mexico and Texas, that is the United States. Number two, Mexico ceded California. They lost California in the war. Now California is gone to the Americans. And New Mexico, that is the American Southwest, from which we will get the states of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, etc. Okay. So Mexico has lost considerable territory here in California and the Southwest. And then point three, the United States agreed to pay $15 million to Mexico. Hopefully you know enough world history to realize that when the winning nation agrees to pay to the losing nation, something's not right. Usually it's the other way around. The losing nation pays the winning nation, but here the Americans are agreeing to pay the Mexicans $15 million. This is conscience money. We have at some level in our minds, we understand that this was an aggressive war on the part of the United States. It was immoral. The Americans are also going to agree to take up the debts that Mexicans owed American citizens. That's another $3 million. So for $18 million then, that is the conscience money Americans are going to pay to Mexico. Now don't let some tricky professor suggest to you that one of the results of the Mexican War is the independence of Texas. That goes back to the point I've been making in these last two lectures. No, Texas has been independent for 10 years, okay? 12 if you count this, the date of the treaty. Well, Polk was angered that Trist had ignored his recall orders. You ignored the President of the United States. But most historians think that Trist did well. The Mexicans were embittered over this war. I would argue the Mexicans haven't forgotten this war yet. Harsher terms would only have made things worse. Nevertheless, some hotheads wanted more, perhaps even taking all of Mexico and then Mexico would be part of the United States. But eventually Polk realized it was far wiser to swallow his anger at Trist and accept the treaty. So what is the legacy of the Mexican War? 17-month-long Mexican War had cost the United States 1,721 soldiers killed in action, about 4,100 wounded. And these are the kinds of statistics that I will not ask you on a test. What difference does it make well, it makes a great deal of difference to the soldiers, of course, but what difference does it make if it was 1,721 or 1,722? There were also, and this is the way war was at this time, 11,155 dead, not of combat wounds, but of disease. Disease is the great killer during wartime. At this point in history and for all of history before this. The military and naval actions had cost $98 million. This amount, combined with the $18 million stipulated in the treaty, meant that for $116 million and almost 13,000 dead Americans, again, these are statistics that I'm not going to ask you on a test, but you should be aware of the nature of the treaty. The United States had acquired 500,000 square miles of territory. And that does not count Texas, because the taking of Texas, the annexation of Texas, was not part of the Mexican War. Now, I do want you to understand, and I will ask you about the results of the war. This includes then California and the American Southwest and so forth. And this territory, as I just said, included California and its magnificent harbors at San Diego and San Francisco, harbors that will eventually make the United States a Pacific naval power. And these territories taken from Mexico also included incalculable mineral and agricultural wealth. These annexations rounded out the continental United States, except for the relatively small Gadsden Purchase a few years later in 1853. The cost of Mexico was, of course, immense, also incalculable. Porfirio Diaz would become, in the late 19th century, a dictator of Mexico. And he would rule Mexico well into the 20th century for 35 years. He said, "Alas, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." This quote takes a little bit of deciphering. Alas, poor Mexico, so far from God. Does Diaz really believe that Mexico, Catholic Mexico, is far from God? No. But the United States is a predominantly Protestant country. So from the American perspective, the Catholic Mexicans are in fact far from God. So far from God and so close to the United States, unlucky in geography. Mexico would have been left alone largely had it not been for the fact that their northern neighbor was the United States, an aggressive and powerful nation. John Eisenhower, the son of Dwight Eisenhower, in his book on the Mexican War, a very fine book, by the way, if you want to read about the Mexican War, I recommend this relatively short book by John Eisenhower. The title of the book is So Far from God. Well, many Americans, as I've already pointed out, felt guilty about taking the Southwest from Mexico. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the great writers of the 19th century, rejected war as a means of achieving American destiny. He doesn't reject the idea of manifest destiny, of moving out west, but he thinks that that will take place naturally. We don't need war to push it along. In spite of the doctrine of manifest destiny, people of the day increasingly saw the war as one of conquest provoked by a president determined on expansion. Now, some historians argue that Polk merely hastened at less cost of blood and money what the march of the American pioneer was destined to achieve anyway. Indeed, it is inconceivable that Americans and Mexicans in California and New Mexico would have remained under the control of a dictatorial Mexico, a Mexico that did not have democracy. Diaz is a dictator. Santa Anna had been a dictator. Americans aren't going to put up with that. So Mexico, in my estimation, could never have held these territories. Finally, many of the American military officers who would play major roles in the Civil War received extensive military experience in the Mexican War. It's a training ground for American commanders in the Civil War. The Mexican War ended in 1848. The American Civil War began in 1861, 13 years. So a relatively junior officer like Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant, both of whom served in Mexico, would be senior commanders, or soon would be senior commanders in the Civil War. Others who received experience in the Mexican War included Jefferson Davis, who would be president of the Confederacy, George McClellan, who would command the Army of the Potomac, that is the most significant army of the North during the Civil War, Joseph Johnston, another Southern general, a talented one, P.G.T. Beauregard, whose artillery would fire the opening shots in Charleston, South Carolina, and most importantly for the North, Ulysses S. Grant. By the way, just as an aside, in his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant argues that the Mexican War was an immoral war. Many others who served in the Mexican War who later played prominent roles in the Civil War. But most important was Robert E. Lee. Lee took several lessons from his Mexican campaign. First was enormous confidence. A military leader who lacks confidence is not going to be effective. General Winfield Scott called Lee a military genius, and I don't know of anybody who argued, well, there are a few, but the vast majority of American historians and military officers believe that Robert E. Lee was, in fact, a military genius. Secondly, Lee learned the value of reconnaissance and knowing the lay of the land. Thirdly, Lee had been instrumental in leading smaller forces. Remember, the Mexicans always outnumbered the Americans. Leading smaller forces to victory over larger forces by expert maneuver. He would employ such tactics in such circumstances repeatedly in the Civil War against the Army of the Potomac. And one of the reasons the Civil War lasts as long as it did and cost as many lives and as much treasure as it did is because Robert E. Lee fought for the South. Well, I thank you for your kind attention, and as always, I pray God's blessing upon you.